Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first episode of Unit Testing. As people start to trickle in here, I just want to lay down some of the ground rules and get a few housekeeping things in order. And then we'll kick off introductions and go straight into the conversation. All of us on the host side are here. So we're super pleased that you're joining us today. My name is Kyle O'Brien. I run Rand Hindy's Angel Fund. And he and I decided to kick off a content series that you're joining for the first time today called Unit Testing, really where we're trying to host entrepreneurs, investors, researchers to discuss topics at the intersection of cutting-edge technology and frontier science, topics that we really love. And today, the focus is on artificial intelligence, psychedelics, and consciousness. So I'll be moderating the conversation, but we've got some great experts, entrepreneurs and investors here in the room with us. And should you have any questions during the meeting, feel free to drop it in the chat. Our friend Brahm is here as well in the background monitoring the chat. He can speak to you directly. But also feel free to chime in. We want this to be engaging and dynamic. So feel free to unmute yourself at the appropriate moment and ask the question out loud if you so wish. Got a couple more people in the waiting room here that I'm going to add. And now we can kick off formally unit testing. So I will hand it over first and foremost to Samantha Tabone, who is with Empath Ventures. Samantha?
Thanks, Kyle. Good morning, everyone. I'm Samantha. I'm a partner at Empath Ventures, a small venture fund focused on investing in psychedelic medicine that's based in Los Angeles. I'm very passionate about the space, excited to be here, very excited about the power that psychedelic molecules have as therapeutics, but also as research tools. So looking forward to chatting. Great to meet you all.
Thanks, Sam. Let's hand it over to Rand for the second introduction.
Hey guys, good to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of people I don't know, so that's pretty exciting. I have to say, seeing all those videos, live, it's I didn't realize it was going to be the same feeling as being in a conference, but it's almost the same. So I'm not a VC. I'm an entrepreneur, actually. My background is in AI. I did a PhD in machine learning 20 years ago. Then after that, I was running a machine learning company, got acquired. And now running a company focusing on privacy. So I got interested in psychedelics first as a way to sort of, expand my ideas. I was sort of stuck feeling not creative anymore a few years ago. And I was like, what do? Do I just live off of my existing ideas, or do I find a way to just open up my brain? And so that's how I got into that and realized that this was an amazing medicine for many, many things that people go through. And so, being lucky that I sold a company, I had the money to invest. And so I decided that this was going to be one of my core investment areas. So AI guy, entrepreneur, that just turns out to love psychedelics and investing in cool projects.
Very cool. Thanks, Rand. And I will hand it over to you, Dillan.
All right, thanks, Kyle. It's good to be with everyone today. So I'm Dillan DiNardo. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Mindstate Design Labs. We are a next-generation psychedelic therapeutics company, and we're using AI to precision design new altered states of consciousness. So I think to kick things off here, I'll talk a little bit more about the company. Kyle, if it's all right, I'll go ahead and share the slides.
Perfect.
Yeah, so for everyone here, Dillan is going to kind of give us an overview of what he's thinking and how he sees everything. But the goal is that after he's been talking, let's just open the floor and feel free to just unmute yourself and start a conversation. So, this is really an open format. We don't have to give you permission to talk, literally just unmute yourself as soon as, Kyle is done.
And Kyle, can you confirm you can see my full screen here?
Yep, you're live.
Awesome. All right. So Mindstate's Design Labs is a portfolio company of Rand and Sam as well, in addition to Y Combinator, Initialized Capital, a number of other VCs and angel investors, including the founders of Neuralink, AngelList, Instacart, Coinbase, Twitch, a number of kind of visionary Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. My personal background is in biotech venture capital. So I worked for a $1 billion venture fund, working in primarily in deep tech, but across a wide variety of biotech investments and operations as well. And I started Mindstate Design Labs with Dr. Thomas Ray. He's our scientific founder. He's made seminal contributions to multiple areas of science. Not enough time to really get into his history today, but he's most famous for being the one who created the first instance of evolution by natural selection after life on Earth. This was the world's first artificial life program to evolve via natural selection. And he's been studying the phenomenology of psychedelics for the past couple decades. And we're taking this underlying tech and applying AI to psychedelics. So very much at the intersection of these fascinating topics here. A bit of an overview of how big this problem is for anyone not familiar. So psychedelic therapy is poised to transform mental health care, and mental health care is actually the largest market in all of life sciences. It dwarfs cancer, it dwarfs cardiovascular disease, and the economic burden goes well north of $1 trillion worldwide. In the United States alone, we spend $280 billion in direct healthcare spending. So that the scope of this problem is just enormous. And I'm sure anyone who's had family or friends or who have experienced mental health care problems yourself, you know that the alternatives that we have, SSRIs, antidepressants, the current forms of therapy just often don't work, or they have prohibitive side effects. And so the unmet need is just absolutely enormous. And very recently, psychedelics have experienced a renaissance. So psychedelics go back tens of thousands of years, at least, maybe longer. People have been using them for medical purposes, for religious purposes. But the Western world rediscovered psychedelics around the 19th and 20th centuries, when globalization resulted in the Western world making contact with some of these indigenous societies who were still using psychedelics. Of course, then the 1960s happened. So psychedelics were hailed in the 40s and 50s as the next great technology in psychology and psychiatry. People called psychedelics the equivalent to the microscope for microbiology, the equivalent to the telescope for astronomy. But unfortunately, psychedelics became entangled in the culture wars of that time, with lots of just widespread abuse of the drugs, involvement in the whole political situation that happened. And as a result, this very unique situation of an area of research being banned kind of happened. So there was really very little psychedelic research for many decades. All of a sudden then, around the 1990s, you begin to see a little bit of research being funded, and psychedelic molecules have been in a variety of clinical trials, then human trials for various mental and behavioral health disorders. And you can see in terms of the publications, there's just in the past few years, a enormous spike. And this is a result of these effect sizes in clinical trials. So to take MDMA as an example, ecstasy, commonly known as a party drug, but it's been applied to treatment-resistant PTSD. These are people who have had PTSD for decades, tried everything possible, nothing works. And with 3 sessions with MDMA, 67% of the patients no longer even qualified for the PTSD diagnosis. And you'll see similar results across different psychedelics. So as a result of these huge efficacy signals, all of a sudden you see enormous interest coming from academia, from industry. You see regulatory processes being opened up as government agencies start to pour funding and pay attention to this new breakthrough class of therapies. I'm not going to spend much time here, except to just say that we're trying to understand why psychedelics work. So every researcher has their favorite explanation for what's going on mechanistically. But the really interesting thing, and the reason psychedelics are so different from existing therapies, is that there's this psychological mechanism. So there's this altered state of consciousness that happens. In psychedelic therapy, you're bringing the patient into a supervised setting. So there's a therapist present or a doctor present. It's typically a very peaceful room with a couch where the patient lays down. They usually have eye coverings and music playing through headphones. that music specially designed to direct the patient inward. And in some way, the patient's state of consciousness fundamentally changes. Their sense of self, their sense of time, the memory function, one of these many fundamental constructs of perception for a very short amount of time changes. And it's that perspective shift, that new place to stand that the patient is able to take that allows us to get to the root cause of whatever the mental health disorder is. And so there's a lot of evidence for this. Let me take a quick example here. Again, let's just stay with MDMA. So if you take MDMA in a recreational setting, if you go to a concert, you're probably going to have a lot of fun, but it's not going to cure your PTSD. But in a therapeutic setting, if you are bringing the patients in with this intention of examining the trauma that's at the root of the diagnosis, the patient enters this state of mind that's termed the entactogenic state. That's the technical term. And it's characterized by overwhelming feelings of empathy, both for self and for others. And there's this overwhelming feeling that all is well with the world. And that results in this ability to safely contemplate mental pain, whatever it is, whatever that trauma was the patient can't face, the trauma that's giving them nightmares, that causes them to have great difficulty in day-to-day life. All of a sudden, the patient can sit with that, face it, talk through it, and very peacefully process that trauma because they're in this entactogenic state of mind. And there are many different states of mind that are similar. So the ego loss state of psilocybin and LSD is a famous one. Ego loss refers to the self construct disappearing. So the patient's awareness will continue to persist, but their concept of them existing as a separate entity from the rest of existence disappears. And this has been profoundly impactful in various therapeutic settings. So you can see some charts on the sides, the association of these states of consciousness with outcomes then in depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, certainly many other mental health disorders. That is what is the central mechanism here, this state of consciousness. So that's the background. What Mindstate Design Labs has done then is we've used our platform. This is our Osmanthus platform. It's an AI-based platform to design specific psychedelic states. So there are many different types of psychedelic states. Psychedelics are not this monolithic entity. You have a great variety of states here. The examples I like to give are NN-DMT. Joe Rogan is famous for championing this particular drug. It's the one where the patient would transition to a completely separate landscape. They become disconnected from the reality here and now. They typically encounter seemingly entities, so aliens, angels, elves, very bizarre experience. And I contrast that to other drugs like 5-MeO-DMT, which is completely different. There are no entities. There is no other place. Instead, it's what you call technically the classical introvertive mystical experience of oceanic boundlessness. So difficult to describe, but essentially all form and content dissolve. It's nothingness. It's a blissful void. I see lots of similarities here to various concepts of nirvana and samadhi and Eastern religion here. So different psychedelics do very different things, and we're trying to figure out why. And there's just no mechanistic understanding, or very little mechanistic understanding at this point. But what we've done in order to disentangle these relationships between the subjective experience, the conscious state, and then the underlying biochemical profile is we've combined those two data sets together. So these drugs have been in use for dozens of years. Sasha and Ann Shulgin, godparents of psychedelics, created these drugs, released the recipes to the world. People have been using these drugs in underground settings and then reporting on those experiences. So we have a massive amount of real world data on the state of consciousness. So we've gathered here 70,000 reports of psychedelic effects in humans, and we've synthesized that data with a giant database of psychedelic drug assays, looking at how each psychedelic interacts with the brain in a different way. And so we're combining AI together with natural history to figure out which biology is leading to which kinds of altered states of consciousness. So we've developed a large index of these conscious states. We've used various approaches using both AI and manual expertise here. It's the magic is really in the combination of natural language processing of those strip reports combined with quantitative calculations of the relationships to subjective experience and to biochemistry. And then it's the manual expertise. So our team's expertise on these states of consciousness. These are very ineffable kinds of experiences. Language has a difficult time grasping those experiences. And so our experts' ability to look at these fantastic metaphors and these drug-induced ravings and collapse them into discernible categories that can then be labeled and calculated is really the key here. And the goal of doing all of this, all of the NLP, all of the AI to calculate these relationships is so that we can then develop better psychedelics. So one thing we could do is more safely and reliably produce whichever therapeutic component is involved in an existing psychedelic state. So we talked about that entactogenic effect. We talked about the ego dissolution effect. There are many others with LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, the first generation psychedelics. But what excites us the most is the second possibility here, which is the possibility of creating new states of consciousness that are outside the scope of existing psychedelics. So that's what we're up to here at Mindstate Design Labs. I'm going to unshare here and turn it back to you, Kyle.
Yeah, Dillan, thanks for presenting all that. I think that lays some really nice groundwork for the conversation today, and hopefully a nice overview for those of you who are less familiar with the space. The psychedelic space is a long and quite fascinating history, ups and downs and legal battles, culture wars. I want to kind of pivot from the history to the pharmacology. I think, Sam, you have a background in pharmacology. I'd love to get your take essentially on what's so promising about these compounds, and why is there this renaissance from, I guess, a pharmacological or chemistry perspective today?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I think what you said about there being this cultural shift, Dillan, that kind of caused the initial war on drugs and the prohibition on research is a really important part in the story. So, this idea of psychedelics being banned on research was really a catalyst to put them into this classification called Schedule 1, which means that they have no real medical use. There's no therapeutic potential, which at the time, even in the era of the war on drugs, was not true. There was quite a bit of research, as you saw, as Dillan showed in his presentation, going on around the therapeutic use cases of psychedelics in psychiatry. One of the reasons I think that perhaps it wasn't as, ubiquitous was because the field of psychiatry was also evolving during that time. And so today, we're at a place in time where there's more openness around different approaches to therapeutic intervention in psychiatry. But from a pharmacological perspective, these compounds, LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, DMT, are all considered psychoactive. So are all of our antidepressants, so are the major and minor cannabinoids. And I don't think that necessarily there's anything specific about each molecular structure that makes one more dangerous than the other. I think that there are classes of compounds that have maybe adverse effects or have more activity at specific receptors. But the psychedelics specifically, there's an ample amount of evidence that shows they've been therapeutic. And I think, as Dillan sagely mentioned as well, the mechanism behind this in terms of molecular biology and pharmacology is not so clear. But we do know that the one thing psychedelics do have in common is the activation of one specific receptor called 5-HT2A. And there's also some debate on whether or not this receptor exclusively alone is responsible for the hallucinogenic effect and maybe some other types of psychoactive or subjective experiences, psychoactive effects. So I think one of the important things to realize is that a lot of these substances are also inspired from nature. So we see a lot of companies looking at new drug discovery, and psilocybin is found in mushrooms. LSD is actually a semi-synthetic compound. You need a specific type of compound, natural compound, to actually synthesize LSD, et cetera. And so, there's no real specific commonality between these compounds per se structurally, but again, it's their pharmacology that kind of unites them. But I think it's also very important to realize that making molecular tweaks can also alter the subjective experience. And so, as Dillan mentioned, he showed you MDMA, a DMT, and 2CB on a slide, which are all 3 different types of compounds. One is something called MDMA was considered like a phenethylamine, so is 2CB, but it can also be considered an amphetamine in some regard. And so, just because a compound belongs to a specific class doesn't mean it's necessarily going to behave exactly like other compounds from that class, which is why segregating based on experience is so important right now.
One of the things I always loved about Mindstate, what convinced me to invest in the early days, is this idea of composable psychedelics, right? That like you can basically take multiple potential drugs, which are acting at multiple different receptor profiles, right? Different receptor profiles. And by combining them, you can shape the psychedelic experience, right? So you can basically create those consciousness states. And, as an engineer, composability is something that we love. That's how we design software, in a way. We basically build different blocks and we put them together, and that's how you end up with the solution, right? The actual behavior you want. And the fact that you could do that in the brain, I find is fascinating. So I remember, like, when I was telling people about Mindstate in the beginning, when I was trying to explain to them, what was so unique, I told them that these guys were figuring out a kind of like algebra, mathematics of psychedelics. And once you do that, you can do so many things. You can design experiences which are not just targeted at a specific indication. You can design experiences which are individual, right? There's like an infinite number of potential treatments down the line. So I think this is like super exciting. And I think there are multiple layers here, right? There is so the composability, which is a very big deal. The fact that 5-HT2A serotonin might not be the only receptor that matters, and we kind of empirically know that, right? Like, everybody here who's done drugs, that if you mix them up, you don't have the same experience. So why people would think that like it wouldn't matter, for me is a little bit weird. Like, it makes so much sense that different receptors are involved in the experience itself. And the fact that we can see that, in those trip reports, like is just incredible. Like, we've had this data sitting there for decades and nobody even thought about looking at what's inside. Like, people are like, forget what people actually experience. Like, let's just look at it from a chemistry perspective. But it's not the whole story. And so I think, it's still controversial, right? That like, psychedelic, like that, consciousness is a multi-receptor kind of thing. But every evidence is pointing towards that. And so, I don't know, maybe Dillan, like, help me understand how Tom, your co-founder, first thought about this. Like, what was his sort of like breakthrough moment, thinking like, holy shit, like we have to expand the way we look at this thing?
Yeah, I like to draw a parallel with the early days of genetics. So you had researchers that would say discover the linkage between a single gene and a disease state or some other biology, and they would build their careers around this one gene, and it would all be about this gene and this disease. And then there would kind of come a new generation of researchers that would say, wait a minute, yes, that is a central piece to the equation. That's the main piece, but this is a network issue. There are many factors here. This is a computational problem. And I think that's what happened with psychedelics. And I think that's what Tom stumbled across. And so maybe to go all the way back. So Tom began working on this in the early 2000s. So the genome had recently been sequenced. And so what that made possible was these assays. So he had this idea when he was 16 years old. This was back in sometime around 1970, I believe, when times were different there, and times were crazy. And Tom had his own personal experiences with different psychedelic drugs, and it had just struck him at that point how incredibly different the experience was. And so he thought immediately, well, there must be different characteristics of the drugs that cause different types of experiences. But researching that wasn't really possible until we figured out how to sequence the genome and assay all of these sites in the brain so that we could start to tease apart all of these contributing factors, both the contributing factors to the phenomenology. Yeah.
Do you think that so he figured out that, this was a multi-receptor thing, right? Do you think that Mindstate could have existed back then? Or is AI really the enabler here, right? Like, would Mindstate exist without AI, even if you already figured out, everything else?
No, it wouldn't. And the problem is that this is subjective human experience. And so Tom could see the patterns in the data, but there wasn't a way to show the math, essentially. And what happened was the recent advances in NLP made that possible. So now that we have the current state of natural language processing, we're able to, in a much more quantified manner, calculate these relationships between different phenomenology and different biochemistry. And so it was the intersection of Tom being in the data for so long and knowing where to look, and then having the NLP advances on top of that to be able to show the math, to prove these relationships, to provide the data, and take the next step forward.
Can I take a bit of a kind of segue here to talk about AI? Because I think this is a great example of what AI is really supposed to be: a human intelligence augmentation, right? Like, if you use AI alone, you might have found some stuff, but you would not have had the depth of understanding to build a company and a theory like what's behind Mindstate. You needed someone, a human, who's reasoning in terms of emotions, in terms of experience, in terms of like environmental interactions, to use AI as a tool to do what they were not able to do by themselves. And, I think like this is a great example of how we should think about AI in general, right? Like, not as a replacement for human intelligence and human minds, but rather as a way to expand our cognitive abilities to, well, figure out solutions like here, right? Like, as you said, Mindstate and in this whole field would not exist if it wasn't for the combination of a human, Tom, and an AI, whatever you want to call it, right? And you, of course, Dillan, right? Not minimizing the importance of the CEO, but, I think, it's really fascinating. People are so scared about what AI can do, but it actually is the key to unlocking what's really going on in their minds.
Yeah, to that end, I'd like to actually kind of take the inverse of what you're describing. We're talking about using AI as a catalyst for psychedelic drug discovery and human augmentation. I'm curious what psychedelic research, what type of implications that might have on how we think about artificial intelligence and consciousness. So I don't know, maybe Sam or Dillan, do you have any thoughts on like what the implications are of all the psychedelic research, the renaissance that's taking place, how that might impact our understanding of AI and its capabilities? It's obviously a topic that's quite hot at the moment. So I kind of want to inverse the thought process here.
Yeah, I can comment, but Sam, do you want to comment first?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just going to say that it's worth pointing out that one of the reasons why Empath was so excited about Mindstate was the fact that, even though a lot of the information that we have on the subjective experience has been reported anecdotally, Mindstate is actively applying R&D and AI to this plethora of information in order to get meaningful information about psychedelics in humans now. And so, we have all of these wonderful clinical trials, all of this R&D that we're going to talk about that can impact AI going on. But in order to glean really useful insights about how that is affecting humans, it's going to take time. Clinical trials take a really long time. And so I think, AI is enabling psychedelics, but psychedelics is also enabling AI. I think one thing I'll just kind of point out, and then maybe Dillan, I guess we could maybe get your take on it too, is this idea of psychedelics being used as tools. So there's this idea called network medicine, which is this emerging area of research dealing with molecular and genetic information, but also these things called biomarkers of disease. And one of the things that we encounter in neurology and psychiatry is this issue of developing drugs that are therapeutic and efficacious. And, psychedelics, work in humans because of all of this previous anecdotal data and the previous research that had been done pre-war on drugs. But one of the issues that we have is that we don't have really good biomarkers for anything in neurology. And network biomarkers provide two-dimensional information. And so, considering established biomarkers in conjunction with this new genetic and molecular information is really useful. But because we don't have that capability in neurology, we need a tool in order to really uncover these like new molecular insights. And I think that psychedelics being studied in different assays with humans and maybe looking to probe the different receptors that maybe aren't 5-HT2A and understand what those effects are in humans is really important in order to feed into this idea of network medicine, which essentially uses a lot of computational methods to stratify patients better. This is this idea of precision psychiatry, precision neurology, which we can talk about later, but yeah, Dillan, really curious to get your thoughts there too.
Yeah, and Kyle had so you were mentioning the impact specifically of psychedelics on AI, and we're an AI-enabled psychedelics company, but what we're more excited about is what our discoveries about the nature of consciousness and the neural correlates of consciousness can then do in informing better AI models. There's always this debate between the computer scientists and the cognitive scientists in developing AI as to whether you use human biology as the inspiration to develop better AI. And of course, there are examples like Jan LeCun and his development of convolutional neural networks and him taking inspiration from the human primary visual cortex. So there are lots of examples where we look at how the human brain does something, and then we can apply that to an AI structure. But it doesn't always work that way. So evolution has constraints that computers don't. It has to use existing materials. It has to use existing processes. And so I think it's a fascinating debate as to whether the next advance in AI, whatever it is that we build on top of LLMs, of large language models, will come from biological inspiration or somewhere else. So it's a fascinating question.
How do you think that we can get an AI to be high? Like, what would be LSD for AI, basically? So, some kind of really interesting prompt that would just make it go nuts, right? I mean, you get that point. Like, it's interesting because I think, when we think about AI, there are two kind of big theories. One of them is, well, artificial intelligence is, at least what we're doing now, is not enough to recreate consciousness, in the sense that you can build bigger and bigger models. You can make them more and more intelligent from a rational standpoint. It doesn't necessarily make them conscious. And then you've got a whole other school of thought called the connectionist theory, which basically says that, emotions and consciousness are just an emanation of the density of connectivity of the brain. And if you can connect an AI as densely as you connect the brain, you will see emerging patterns that looks like consciousness and emotions. They might be a little bit different because the perception of the world is different, but it will still be, consciousness. And I was thinking about that the other day. I was at this event in Paris called PAWA, where they basically invited a bunch of tech people to talk about tech and a bunch of indigenous people to talk about, the exact opposite of tech, right? So how do you go back to living with nature? And one thing I realized was that if you can recreate artificial consciousness in some capacity, then how can you actually tell that you're not yourself a conscious AI? Like, that blurs away completely the difference between a human consciousness and AI consciousness. And so I kind of don't want to answer that question. And I hope that nobody's going to be able to build a conscious AI, because, I'm very happy feeling that I'm sort of like a different type of animal here.
Yeah,
Yes,
the neuros.
fascinating.
Go ahead.
No, on to you, Sam. Yeah.
I was just about to say, I think your question is really interesting. The neuroscience of consciousness is really nascent and complicated. I think a way to get AI high, so to speak, is to use, again, psychedelics as tools to better understand the neuroscience of consciousness. Once we do that and we're able to pseudo-simulate what maybe different altered states of consciousness look like based on these findings, again, also based on the way we understand the subjective experience, what Dillan is doing at Mindstate, et cetera, we will really have a lot more opportunities to model different network systems in the brain, which is very important for many things, but it is kind of scary to think about.
So speaking of
by the way, Kyle, sorry,
go ahead.
Jackim, is that how you say your name?
It's Yakim. Yeah.
Sorry.
I wanted to ask a question, but it's unrelated.
No need to raise your hand. Just unmute yourself and have
Cool. So I wanted to ask a more pragmatic question, right? So I'm a drug designer, and I really, see that there's some cool things of looking at connecting the phenomenology to different, biochemical parameters. But I think and also the presentation kind of cut short before talking about how that translates back to the unmet need that you mentioned earlier, the burden of different kinds of disease. So I would to ask, what is the process of getting this, what you made, to actual drugs? Because that is, I think, the biggest question, right? Like, how do we get psychedelics to turn into therapeutics that actually cure people? So what will be kind of an outline of getting there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So once we have this map of the connections between the phenomenology that's important and the human subjective experience and the human effects, and then the underlying biochemistry, what you have is a screening system where you can then screen new chemical entities, you can screen combinations of drugs for the ideal biochemical profiles. And the biochemical profiles you're optimizing for are going to be, for one, the underlying biology, so the neuroplasticity plays a role, and we can go into that. I think there were some questions in the chat about that as well. But then also the experience. So what is it about that particular pattern of connectivity in the brain that induces that particular altered state that results in the therapeutic outcome? So making it concrete with one example. So if we take ego dissolution, for example, there's great early evidence that it's very helpful to experience ego dissolution for patients who have depression due to a terminal cancer diagnosis. So what's happening is the patient is experiencing that state where all is one. They don't exist. Their identity doesn't exist anymore, but they are part of everything. And it comes with this profound sense that everything is okay. And this type of experience, the state of consciousness, then carries forward into the patient's life. They remember this, and it has the impact on the depression diagnosis. And so it's incredibly effective. But you have to draw the links between what is the biology to what is the state of consciousness to what is the clinical outcome. And so there's all this connection between which effects are relevant to efficacy, which effects are relevant to safety, to compliance. But it's all about drawing that complete line from underlying neurochemistry to the neural correlates to the drug to the treatment outcome itself.
Yeah, I suppose I wanted to ask because, you can do in silico predictions for compounds, and I understand that you can do that for a lot of things. But essentially what the drug development process is, when you have to validate that your predictions are correct with biochemical assays, with in vitro neuroplasticity assays, and toxicity studies, and all those different things, right? And so you're most definitely not gonna have, okay, this drug is it is, and we're just gonna do all those studies to confirm that it is the one. But it's more like an iterative process where you select, okay, like here 100 compounds might be that, we test them, and then so if you are predicting for these high level mind states, like you cannot really just make 100 compounds and give that, do clinical trials and see if they elicit that mind state in humans. You need some kind of smaller steps within animal models at least, or something. So that's what I was asking about. How do you get that to the clinic if you most likely cannot just say, okay, this is the perfect combination, or we're gonna, and they're not even gonna give you an IND for that. You need to prove that there's, beyond reasonable doubt, efficacy and safety of these compounds. So that's what I'm asking. Are there some kind of models that could translate to the mind states that you're predicting for?
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's this central problem in psychedelic drug development that there isn't a translational model for different states of consciousness. So you can look at head twitch in rodents, which corresponds to 5-HT2A activity, but the mouse isn't going to tell you what kind of ego loss it's experiencing, for example. So what we do is really invert the entire drug development process. It's sort of this reverse translation where you start with the human experience and then you back translate into new animal models and then into in vitro and our in silico model, which is the Samantha's platform. So the first proof of concept in the clinic is where we take a very selective serotonergic drug, so very selective for 5-HT2A, and then we combine it with a non-psychedelic, so a drug for Parkinson's or blood pressure or something like that hits one of these targets. And we do this A/B testing in an experimental medicine study in humans in order to prove out that the predictions in silico translate to the human experience, which then validates the intermediate animal models. So it's very unusual to do the drug discovery process that way, but that's what's been enabled by this human data.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, right? Like it's like you can combine things that individually wouldn't give you what you need in order to actually get what you need. And so, like, you know, having a model for doing that is incredible. I mean, that's what I meant by composability, right? This isn't about one drug doing what you want. It's potentially a cocktail of drugs doing what you actually want. Donovan, you have a question?
Yeah, I have this longstanding interest in cognitive enhancement. So LSD has been used by chip makers to get insight into, you know, how to design better computer chips. And it feels like, you know, that's one of the huge unexplored possibilities of psychedelics is this cognitive enhancement of creativity or insight connection. You know, it's not a mental health thing. It's just like how to optimize humanity. So how is that kind of coming into this whole equation? So anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we don't really think about lack of creativity as a psychological, as a mental health issue, right? But you could think of it this way. I mean, that's definitely how I felt. That's what got me into psychedelics. A few years ago, really, I was stuck. I was like I cannot think of anything new. Every idea I thought I had was just some rehashing of some old ideas I had in the past. And I would open my old notebooks and was like, oh, I thought about this 5 years ago. Shit, like this isn't particularly new. And I got really depressed. I was like, that's it, like I'm 30 something and then I'm going to live 100 more years with no new ideas. And the thought of that just honestly just shattered me. Like I was like, that's it. I've passed my peak. And then I discovered psychedelics, right? And it was like, well, I've always been kind of against drugs at the time. I was like, take LSD, you'll go crazy the rest of your life kind of thing, because at least that's what everybody told me since I was a kid. But I spoke to a lot of very clever people, very smart people who were doing a lot of psychedelics, not as a way to get out of depression necessarily, but as a way to expand their creativity. And when I tried, I mean, first of all, it was amazing, but I didn't do it in a party setting. The first time I tried psychedelics was blindfolded with music. And the journey felt like, it was like all of a sudden, everything I could think about, I could think about it from a different perspective. And I got out of it. And the month that followed, I had more ideas than the past 5 years. And I'm not saying that you need psychedelics to be creative, but as a ladder to get out of a hole in which you're stuck, it's very effective, very, very effective. It just gives you a different perspective on things.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. So in Plants of the Gods, right, Albert Hoffman and Schulte's kind of work that they did together, they were talking about how the Greek, basically the Greek Renaissance or whatever was caused by the ergot beer being drunk by, in the Eleusinian mysteries. And it seems to me really profound that maybe psychedelics is the key to opening up all the creative avenues we need to solve the phenomenal amount of problems that we have right now in the world. We need that different perspective. So
if you reattach it to reality, right? I feel that's something that a lot of people who get into psychedelics sometimes forget. is that you have to come back. Like ego is a good thing if you want to get shit done. Because like if you're always egoless, if you're always kind of like in creative mode, you might have a ton of ideas, but you're not going to have the discipline necessarily to put it in practice. And so I think it's a cycle. You have to go through cycles of opening your mind and cycles of actually refocusing on what you've just discovered and just bringing it to reality. And that's very, very difficult because it's very tempting to just be creative and not do anything about it. It feels great to have ideas. It doesn't feel good to work.
So I'm just taking a look at time. We've got about 12 minutes left. There's a couple of questions and also a couple of topic areas that I think might be interesting to kind of close out the discussion, talking more pragmatically about the future of medicine and the psychedelic therapeutics and how they might work. So I'm going to try to synthesize a few things at once here. First, there was some discussion in the chat around non-hallucinogenic compounds and how they might actually be effective for kind of deep mystical experiences based on some Nature article that was recently released. This is from Neil at Merida Capital Holdings. I think he may have left, unfortunately. Otherwise, I'd have him expound on that a little bit more.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Oh,
Kyle.
Neil, go for it. Yeah,
Okay.
give us some context.
So, I mean, I think the question is, or my question is really about your perspective on non-hallucinogenic compounds. It seems intuitively like the phenomenological aspects of the psychedelic experience are quite essential to the therapeutic benefits. But then again, we are looking at different ways to account for neuroplasticity, for example, which seems to play a large role in the therapeutic benefits and their persistence. There is a very interesting article in Nature that posited that classical psychedelics also bind to the TRKB receptor, which antidepressants also bind to. And in the presence of BDNF, they promote neuroplasticity. And they do this, they bind to the receptors with much, much higher affinity, like 1,000-fold classical antidepressants, which brings up the question of whether or not the phenomenology is actually central to the therapeutic benefits. So I just wanted perspective. I certainly don't have an answer.
Yeah, I can give my personal perspective, but for context here, this is an ongoing, constant debate in the psychedelics world, and it's a fascinating question. Glad you brought it up. But there's the so the two camps kind of are the pharmacologists, so right, the people who are looking at the head twitches in rodents, and the idea is you edit out the hallucinogenic effect, you can make a take-home pill that you can just distribute at scale, and that would be wonderful. That'd be amazing for patients, right? Because then you don't have to bring them in and supervise them and have them go through the experience. And so, you know, it's very a very compelling story for a pharmacologist. On the other side of the debate, you have the people who are doing clinical studies with psychedelics, and so they kind of ridicule the idea that you could have the biology without the trip and still have the therapeutic impact. And so the two sides kind of debate each other. And I'll say that, first of all, my personal opinion doesn't matter. Either the neuroplasticity is the fingerprints of the phenomenology, and the phenomenology drives the therapeutic response, or vice versa. The phenomenology is the fingerprints of the neuroplasticity, and by mapping the phenomenology, we do the translation process that we don't have right now. So I'd say my opinion doesn't matter, but my opinion is that the trip is central here. I like to draw the analogy to, well, there's a psychedelic study that showed that 4 out of 5 participants regard the psychedelic experience as one of the top 5 experiences of most significant experiences of their life, similar to the birth of their first child or the death of a parent. And so, you know, I think saying that neuroplasticity drives the treatment responses is like saying, you know, babies drive neuroplasticity. They don't, you know, you can have a baby and not know it, and no neuroplasticity happens. It's holding this thing in your hands that is your DNA and your blood, and having the realization that now I'm responsible for this life. It's the experience, it's the higher order brain functions interacting with the environment that drives the majority of the response. And so that's the face valid model at this point. But I would definitely love to be proven wrong.
Maybe Khalil and then DM. Sorry, I don't know what your full name is.
Yeah, thank you. I had another question for Dillan, actually. It was about the reverse translation process, because you talked about it earlier. And I think most startups that try to make discoveries using AI try to train machine learning models on large observational data sets. That's the case, for instance, in oncology, because I mean there are a lot of public data sets out there, but for psychedelics, it seems that it's mostly anecdotal evidence. So those trip reports, for instance, which I'm sure are very valuable, but I was wondering how exactly do you try to predict or translate the language in terms of potential therapeutic effect? Because often the language that is used in those trip reports is kind of elusive or at least hard to interpret in terms of psychological effects. So how do you leverage NLP and the knowledge of your experts to try to predict potential therapeutic effect from those trip reports?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. The quality of trip reports is hugely variable. And I think part of that problem you solve via scale. Part of the problem we solve via using other sources of data. So the NLP is a part, but you also have the neuroplasticity assays, you have the animal assays, you have clinical trials where, then you have statistical significance and supervision and validated rating scales and everything that you need to really validate the connection. But the key, as Rand alluded to earlier, is the expertise that we have. So Tom, having spent the past couple of decades, Dr. Tom Ray, our scientific founder, looking into the phenomenology here and understanding what are people talking about? And then we have our project manager, Josie Kins, is another example. So she founded psychonautwiki.org, effectindex.com, many of the prominent psychedelic websites and communities. And she's just spent the past couple decades in the details here. And so many on our team have experienced these states themselves. So, Josie's done hundreds of different psychedelic drugs. So it's the combination of the personal experience, the engagement in the culture to understand what are the motifs, what are the metaphors, how do people talk about these things? And people may talk about a common experience in wildly diverging ways. So being able to do the manual characterization to then train the NLP model to then produce the outputs and then evaluate by experts and iterate is really the key here. And it's a hugely subjective process. And so ultimately just seeing the statistical significance we're seeing with these relationships and seeing that significance improve over time as we train the model is what kind of gives us confidence in the method.
Just to add on to that, Dillan, another question from DM in the chat, just because we're running out of time here. Do you have any demographic data around the trip reports? What is who are they coming from? What kind of, I guess, metadata, so to speak, do you have on the people providing this feedback?
Yeah, we do. Unfortunately, it is hugely dominated by young white males. So that is an issue, but being able to take cuts of the data does allow us to look at the effects on gender. And there are in particular a number of variances that are very clinically important when it comes to gender. There's often information also on just body weight and height. Usually we don't have lots of information on ethnicity or other factors. And so that's a huge limitation to the data, unfortunately. And so that's something that we're addressing in clinical trials, making sure we have the diverse population when it comes to actually getting the clinical validation of the prediction.
Right. Well, we've only got a few minutes left here. I think we've gotten to most of the questions, although chime in if you have some lingering burning question. I think a nice way to close out would actually be to look towards the future. I guess I'll pose the question to all three of you. What are you most excited about in psychedelic medicine, drug development, and research for the coming decade, let's say? And maybe we can start with you, Rand.
Hard to tell. I think what excites me the most, to be honest, is that people realize and start using this as a way to solve some mental health problems and also expand, the way they see things. I think, we've been stuck for too long with things that didn't work. And we have an opportunity now to change that. So I'm just excited that we no longer have to hide it, that, I can talk to my parents about it, that is perfectly fine. and that it's no longer stigmatized. The sooner we do that, the better off we are as a society, I believe.
Nice. What about you, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was mentioning earlier about trying to get more precise disease modifying therapeutics is something exciting. I do think that psychedelics have the potential to help us understand the origin of different mental illness a lot more effectively. So I think, looking forward, the marriage of, computational tools, artificial intelligence, and psychedelics will unlock a whole new level of understanding of disease etiology. So I'm very excited about that.
Great. And Dillan?
I'm excited about the intersection of these different technologies, how AI continues to improve, how our biochemical tools continue to improve, and how that enables the design of states of consciousness that are far beyond the scope of the drugs that we know, and states of consciousness that are much more safe, much more reliable, much more predictable, and that have direct impact on specific diseases and on things outside of medicine, even eventually, and impacting the world and the various problems that we face outside of mental health as well.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in just under an hour. So I want to thank all of the panelists, Dillan, Sam, Rand, for joining today. I hope this was valuable for everyone that joined the call. Thanks so much for taking an hour out of your day to hop on and listen and contribute in some cases. Fantastic questions. This has been recorded as well, so we're going to share this on our YouTube channel and on socials. If you want to share with any of your peers or colleagues or rewatch, you are more than welcome to do that. And stay tuned. We're going to have more conversations like this across a variety of topics in frontier science and deep tech. So thanks to everyone for coming, and we'll see you around on the internet.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.